Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on the 2nd of April. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information, which you can always find by calling the Alaska Weather Information Line. 1-800-472-0391 is the easy way to do that. Weather.gov/Alaska is your online access to weather around the state, current observations, satellite and radar pictures, and certainly any watches, warnings, or advisories for your area that will tell you that dangerous weather is on the way or could be affecting your community in a short amount of time. But you can also get your daily forecast. One click on the map will take you to your local forecast office and all the information there, as well as links to the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center and the current breakup information for your region and your rivers, as well as fire danger and a whole lot of other information that you may find useful. If you can't find what you need, let me know at david.snider@noaa.gov. That's my email. I see it all the time, and I'm happy to serve you any way I possibly can. Let's take a look at what's going on across your part of Alaska. As colder air is dropping southward out of the Arctic tonight, we do expect the winds to come up across the Yukon Flats into the upper Koyukuk and certainly into the central parts of the interior, including the Tanana Valley. It looks like north and easterly winds will be blowing anywhere from about 20 to 30 miles per hour. After about 9-10 o'clock or so, the winds should really start to come up. And you're going to see some gusts up to about 40 miles per hour or so. And this could be a problem for the Elliott and the Steese highways, especially some of the higher terrain, it looks like, will be more susceptible to some of those higher winds. So gusts to about 40 miles per hour or so. It certainly could move the car around a little bit more than you planned on, so hold on to the wheel just a little bit extra, and certainly expect to see those winds in the region until about maybe 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The good news is we don't have any significant fire danger in the region right now, though we do have a fire that was a little bit closer to Juneau. It sounded like something that had just kind of developed there around Eagle Beach earlier this morning, and conditions are drying out across the interior with wind moving in. That could be an exacerbated problem, but the good news is the humidity will likely lower just a little bit more as that colder air comes in, so probably not a significant change in that as we head into tomorrow. But the season is early and it is developing. As we look at the satellite picture, we have one, maybe two main weather systems that we're watching. First of all, high pressure sitting across the Gulf, and we have low pressure still out in the west. You can see that generally moving to the north and to the west, dragging a whole lot of moisture across the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Bering, just grazing southwest Alaska. But the new change is that Arctic air dropping in from the north, and as that drops southward, you can kind of see a little bit of that happening right in here with the cloud cover shifting southward. That's going to bank up against the Alaska range. That big wall of rock is really going to keep south central and most of southeast in the free and clear from this developing weather change. While it will cool down and we will see more clouds across a large part of the interior and even south central and parts of southeast, it doesn't look like a really significant, sharp, cold blast will be moving in, even though temperatures will be going down. The net effect of this will be more clouds and probably a change in the wind across the region, which will help it to feel colder, of course. But as that colder air kind of gradually finds its way through the nooks and crannies of the rocks, you'll get to see a little bit more of that northerly breeze in places like Haines and Skagway and the Lynn Canal, and probably around the Copper River Delta region and into the Cook Inlet area. In the meantime, the front is working through the interior this afternoon. High pressure is just north of Utqiagvik at 1,042 millibars. Watch for areas of snow and some fog across the Beaufort Seacoast, Dead Horse, Prudhoe Bay, all the way out toward Kaktovik, and that's dropping southward. Precipitation amount should be pretty light, so we're not expecting any major winter storm with this, but it is going to cool off considerably. To the west, a front is working across the central and western chain. That's going to bow itself northward toward the Pribilofs as we head through tonight. The low's down to 965. Watch for gale force winds across the chain. Nothing too significant at this point, with high pressure sitting across the Gulf, 1,009 millibars there, and a trough of low pressure lies across southeast and just offshore of Prince William Sound and the Kenai Peninsula. We're going to see most of the rain kind of hover there across the western communities, and maybe not even that, just kind of over the Pribilofs, a period of rain and snow perhaps tomorrow. Notice that cold front across the interior doesn't make a whole lot further inroads southward, so banked up against the rocks, it looks like we're going to get a little bit more of a stiff breeze, and that's where that northeasterly wind really comes into play throughout tonight and into tomorrow. Once again, places like Tanana all the way up toward Bettles and then eastward into Fort Yukon, probably looking at some gustier northeasterly winds, some of those as strong as 40 miles per hour. Areas of fog across the Beaufort Seacoast down toward Arctic Village and maybe across the Alcan border itself as high pressure starts dropping even further southward toward Utqiagvik, 1,035 millibars there. Clouds start to take over southeastern Alaska. That front trying to work its way into the Panhandle. We may see clouds and precipitation as close as some of the higher terrain around the highway passes there around the Klondike. And certainly closer to Haines and Skagway, but maybe not in town just yet. It looks like Wednesday could be more of a cloudier, breezy day than a day with snow in the region, but we're going to keep watch on that. Out west, low pressure drops to 965. We've got a new low trying to work its way into the weather picture from the south at 967. By Thursday, that's moving eastward because the high in the Gulf is pretty much gone now. It's been chipped away at enough that it gets out of the way. Low pressure finally pushes through Prince William Sound. This will probably be a breezier day, maybe a bumpy day for aviation concerns around south central and into southeastern Alaska as this front is swinging through. This could be a better chance for some light precipitation from Juneau northward toward Haines, Skagway, Gustavus. South of that, it looks like at least a chance for some rain showers or just general light rain there as we still have low pressure in the region and enough moisture out ahead of that front that you could get a little bit of some wet weather out of that, but not a whole lot. Out across the central and eastern chain, periods of light rainfall there. Showers a little more likely around Bristol Bay to Kodiak Island, and just dry and breezy weather for most of the interior. All the way out to the west coast, we've got a north and east wind sweeping out into the Bering that's going to keep a lot of this region here across the northern Bering fairly clear. High pressure really never drops into Alaska. It's going to just hover offshore. That may keep that north and easterly flow right into the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast. That has me concerned with some areas of fog and maybe some poor visibility lingering in there. And you'll see that in the aviation forecast coming up with a kind of a swath of IFR conditions lingering across the northern coast. That's why that's happening. Out across the west, low pressure sits across the western chain at 975. We'll keep that band of kind of wetter, cloudier weather right here across the Bering, but you'll notice it's shifted from what we were looking at earlier, a little bit further out to the west now. So that's going to keep more of a breezy conditions across the west coast, maybe some turbulence because of the speed coming off some of the higher terrain here in southwestern Alaska, but overall a dry weather picture really for most of the interior with a chance for some increasing areas of showers and certainly breezier conditions across Gulf Coast communities. Here's a look at temperatures as we go into tonight. It looks like 30s and 40s for most of southeast, fairly mild, lower 30s and cooling off a little bit for south central. Fairbanks down to 13 tonight, about 10 to 12 below for areas on the north slope up toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. 21 above in Shishmaref, 24 above for Nome, lower to mid 30s for southwest. Bristol Bay temperatures a little bit cooler around King Salmon and closer to 40 around Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. High temperatures tomorrow nearing 50 around Bristol Bay, 51 for Lake Iliamna in fact, 32 for Fairbanks, and a little bit above zero for most areas in the North Slope, 5 for Kaktovik. Southeast, low to mid 50s, south central, mid to upper 50s, Cordova 48.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to your aviation weather now. We'll keep low pressure out in the Bering Sea and surrounding that area, low ceilings and visibility from St. Paul all the way into the western chain and along the windward side of the Alaska Peninsula, especially around Sand Point, Cold Bay, and False Pass. South of AKwx and into the coastal areas of south and eastern Kodiak Island, we're going to see marginal conditions there, but then after that, things really clear up. Notice we're still talking about a decent start for Wednesday morning in southeast, most of Prince William Sound, south central, southwest, the interior, but you'll notice on the windward sides of the Alaska Range, all the way from east to west, and also around Tanita Pass, maybe even Mentasta Pass, we're talking about lower restrictions there as northerly winds are trying to set in. Also watch for areas of IFR across the northern parts of the Seward Peninsula and just offshore of Utqiagvik and the Arctic coast. That starts to change Wednesday afternoon with more northerly winds pushing in. IFR conditions set into Prudhoe Bay, Dead Horse, all the way out toward Kaktovik. St. Matthew all the way down to St. Paul and St. George, and continued areas around the windward side of the Alaska Peninsula and southern Kodiak Island, as well as areas in the Gulf start to fill in a little bit more. Still looking pretty good in southeast, but you can barely see it. Just a hint of marginal conditions are dropping into Haines and Skagway, mainly along the highways and the passes, not so much into Haines and Skagway itself. And we'll see continued changes there as we start to get into Thursday morning. Marginal conditions to IFR all the way down into the central and southern parts of southeast. More spots in the Gulf starting to fill in. We're still looking at the same old places there across the Alaska Peninsula and the central and western parts of the Bering, including St. Paul and St. George. Again, on flying day, not such a great plan. And then IFR conditions there for the central and eastern Beaufort seacoast, and maybe as far west as Utqiagvik and southward toward Atkasuk. Thursday afternoon, very little change on the north slope, very little change out in the west. That IFR band may shift a little bit further west there, hopefully improving conditions enough to fly there for St. Paul and St. George. Marginal conditions for most of the Gulf, and hit and miss marginal levels there for the central parts of the Panhandle. Still looking at generally VFR for most of south central, southwest, and the interior. Here's your pass conditions. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass look pretty good for Wednesday. For Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we're going to call VFR there. Rainy Pass, though, starts at marginal levels and improves throughout the day. We'll see similar trends in Windy Pass, Isabel Pass, and Mentasta Pass, all starting out at marginal levels, but hoping for improvement. Tenita Pass also looking like marginal levels to start your Wednesday. As we get into Portage Pass, things look pretty good through most of Wednesday afternoon, and we'll see that very slight shift toward marginal levels, generally at the pass level, not so much down in town as we get into Wednesday afternoon for Chilkoot and White. Notice the surface freezing line doesn't change too much. We're still seeing a lot of warm air here across the southern Bering, but that dip is certainly showing up a little bit further south across the Gulf Coast and into southwestern Alaska. Freezing levels are rising here now from the Alaska Peninsula all the way into southeast, where they're up to about 4,000 to 6,000 feet or higher. Icing potential is also starting to show up a little bit more, anywhere from about 6,000 to 8,000 feet across the Bering at St. Paul, St. George, and the central and western chain especially. And we're just getting clipped by some of that isolated moderate potential across the eastern Brooks Range down toward Arctic Village, and then also around the Copper River Basin, generally from McCarthy eastward toward Haines and Skagway, generally above about 5,000 feet. The jet stream is just being weird. High pressure across the Bering Strait, showing that strong southerly draw, mostly moving westward and then driving back in from the north and west across western Alaska at around 60 knots. And then we have this northerly push. That Arctic air mass is dropping southward, and again, that's what's going to bring that next weather pattern change for a lot of folks, especially in the central and eastern interior, south central, and southeast. The west doesn't seem to change very much, and the Pacific jet in the same old spot there, coming into lower parts of the 48. 9,000 feet, you've got a north and easterly flow working into the central and western parts of Alaska. Low pressures forming here around the Copper River Basin and the Yukon. Southwesterly winds coming into southeastern Alaska, and here's that big draw coming in from the east and southeast across the Bering Sea, all connected to low pressure a little bit further west. Broad easterly flow sweeping across at 3,000 feet for most of the interior, otherwise about 30 to 40 knots there. We've got our northerly push that's making its headway in. A lot of that cold air is really going to work its way into the Yukon instead of making its way into all of Alaska right now, but some of that will get shunted off, especially north and west of the Alaska Range. And southwesterly winds continue to be fairly light into southeast Alaska, with east and southeasterlies continuing for the Bering. So where are the turbulence problems? It looks like, as this weather pattern is shaping up, we're probably going to see some considerable moderate here across the central and western interior throughout the day. Fairly widespread from the lower and middle Yukon, probably the lower Koyukuk Valley, and then choppy stuff out around St. Matthew in the central and western chain, with a better chance for considerable moderate from Kiska and westward. South central, southeast, the Alaska Peninsula, and most of the North Slope should be okay.
When you think of a national park, you probably envision wide open natural spaces, undisturbed by human activity. There are indeed such places, but even in some of the most remote areas of a place like Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska, the mark of man is present. Marine debris is a menace to the farthest reaches of our globe, and even designated national park lands are not immune. In the summer of 2009, the Resurrection Bay Conservation Alliance, a grassroots conservation organization based in Seward, Alaska, decided to do something about the marine debris fouling the beaches of Kenai Fjords National Park. Marine debris coordinator Tim Johnson had first-hand experience with the issue.
The summer before, my wife and I, Michelle, had done a paddle from Seward, sea kayak paddle from Seward to Homer. Really, our eyes were open to some areas that we didn't realize there was so much accumulation. It was very deceiving up front. You couldn't really get a feel for the extent and impact of it. You've got this nice high tide line that's quite pristine, and you really don't get a picture for the impact, the amount of debris in that area until you get behind those storm berms. You get back into the lagoons and the vegetation around those lagoons. And then you see the absolute extent back into that veg and how intertwined and enmeshed these decades of trash deposition. So we were just appalled by that and said we got to get something together on a larger scale.
The Resurrection Bay Conservation Alliance is a local nonprofit community organization, and they have been instrumental in helping the Park Service obtain funding to get larger boats to help move the debris, and they get volunteer labor and organize the work trips. And so it's really a partnership between the Park Service and the community to help get out and really get a project done that in and of itself any one group couldn't do on their own.
Most of that trash was baggable. However, there were large items, huge, piles of hauser line, for example, that we just had to hoist up onto the boat.
The volunteers didn't just bag, haul, and hoist the garbage, but also carefully recorded what types of debris were collected.
In many ways, the debris itself is a resource. Archaeologists use middens, the trash heaps, as a way of analyzing past cultures. And in one sense, marine debris is a form of a midden. It's a trash heap that left for the future would be something that people could use to analyze our culture. It may not say the best things about our culture or everything that we want, but we need to be able to document what we've done so that we can preserve that legacy, make sure that we as a society don't forget what we've been doing.
We had two larger categories of marine debris that we picked up. Commercial fishing means like, say, gill nets, large hauser lines, anything that would be associated with more of a commercial fishing scale. And then the second category was more recreational fishing and household, which would be general plastics, things like that. So we had about a 75% of the commercial fishing marine debris element, and about 25% of the recreational and household further out the bay. And we had the exact opposite the closer we got to Seward. Within the bay, it was about 25% commercial fishing versus 75% recreational fishing and household.
The trash is not just unsightly for park visitors, but also poses threats to wildlife and marine habitat.
Really one of the larger issues now that you go to this plastic that can really get into the food web and affect the food web differently than something like glass.
These substances, for instance, all these polystyrene blocks that are breaking down into all these little crumbly bits are further breaking down on a microscopic level, and how much of an impact that has, in this ecosystem is yet to be determined, but I think it's got pretty high potential.
Well known that sea turtles will eat plastic bags floating in the water. They look like jellyfish to a sea turtle, and obviously a plastic bag doesn't go well in the digestive system of a turtle. Albatross will see small pieces of plastic floating on the surface and think they're small fish and other food sources, and eat that in their stomachs, especially in some of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. They'll find dead albatross that have starved to death with a full stomach, and it's full of pieces of plastic.
We're affecting our local areas this way, but we need to be thinking about it from more of a state and global, international scale. And most importantly, to try and focus on prevention of it coming in the first place. Because we're just going to see this continuing, to build up on our beaches unless we're able to get a little bit more of an approach on prevention on the front end.
Marine debris is really a global problem, in all the oceans, and there are many different sources. Global shipping is one. Fishing debris from commercial fishing, recreational boating activity on land, stuff blowing off land, washing down streams, people just throwing stuff on the shore.
Though the problem can seem overwhelming, Johnson remains upbeat about making a positive difference.
No, you gotta start locally. You gotta take control of what you can do, and make something with that, and try and move on from there.
Overall, more than 9 tons of debris was removed from the beaches of Kenai Fjords National Park and transported back to Seward to be deposited in a landfill.
People gave a lot to the project in order to make it happen. That was awesome. One of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. Being able to put that large of a group of volunteers together, dedicated volunteers to put that much effort and give that much time and pull all the different agencies together to see it all happen was incredible. It was incredible. Yeah, very fulfilling experience.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And back with an update on your marine areas, and around the Bering Strait you can still see some 80% or higher concentration ice. That's what we have colored in white here. The blue areas less than 80% to down to about 20, and then everything else below that's generally open water, maybe even sea ice free. And that's really the state of affairs north of St. Matthew to very close to St. Lawrence Island and pushing into western sections of Norton Sound. Now, a lot of this is still on the move and will be on the move with a stronger north and easterly flow cutting across the northern Bering in the next several days. So plan on ice moving away and out of the eastern ends of Norton Sound. Kotzebue Sound will probably see some movement. The Plenia here across the Chukchi coast will probably change its shape and orientation a little bit. So just be prepared for some changes across the west coast there as that north and easterly flow moves in. It would not be unheard of to see more ice form, though, as cooler air is moving into the region, but the winds are going to prevent some of that from happening very quickly. So just plan on changes there across the west coast. In southeast, northerly winds coming up in the Lynn Canal, 20 knots and 4-foot seas there tomorrow out of the north again. Southeasterlies in Clarence Strait, and generally light and kind of somewhat variable winds across the outer coast. Seas running around 4 to 5 feet tomorrow, but you'll start to pick up a south and easterly flow coming off the outer coast for Thursday, 25 to 30. 5 to 7 foot seas there. Northerlies come up even more in the Lynn Canal, 25 knots and 5-foot seas, and east and southeasterly winds for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait, looking at 3-foot seas holding on there in the inside waters for Thursday. For South Central, 25 knots from the north and east through Prince William Sound, 4-foot seas there. Gusts coming out of the Copper River Delta, about 35 knots. Sustained winds a little bit lower, but those gusts will be fairly sharp when they come through. 4-foot seas there across most of the north and western Gulf. North and easterlies coming down Cook Inlet as strong as 25 knots, and seas will probably come up even more around the Barrens between Kenai and the western Barrens, anywhere from 5 to about 6 feet or so. For Thursday, north and easterly winds are picking up on the eastern side of the Barrens as well, 25 to 30 knots with 7 to 9 foot seas. Improvement there in Prince William Sound. Winds come down to 15 knots. North and easterly winds shift to more of an easterly direction in the Copper River Delta. 8-foot seas expected there. Northeasterly still blowing in the northern Cook Inlet at 20 knots with 6-foot seas. Through Shelikof Strait, northeasterly winds 20 knots and 6-foot seas there. A little bit more of a southwest wind holding on the east side of Kodiak Island, and easterlies crossing over the Alaska Peninsula, holding at about 15 knots for just about all areas. 3 to 4-foot seas in the Bering Sea coast and 8 to 10-foot seas there for the Pacific. As we get into your Thursday, look for northeasterly winds to be fairly uniform with 20 to 30 knots, though, the strongest of which will be around Shelikof Strait and from AKwx down toward about Sand Point with 9 to 12-foot seas in the region, 4 to 6-foot seas across the Bering Sea coast, 20 knots there for the Bristol Bay region. Look for southerlies for the central and eastern chain, anywhere from 10 to 25 knots. The lightest winds around Unalaska to Nikolsky, and some of the strongest as you move out to the west, southeast, I should say, 25 to 30 knots. About 15 to 17-foot seas out in the west. You're looking at about 18 to 19, though, south of Atka to Nikolsky. For Thursday, you can see the west and northwesterly winds starting to cut in a little bit here. As you notice, seas coming up to about 6 to 7 feet in the Bering and about 12 to 15-foot seas there from the west and northwest. Out across the western chain, this is still under the influence of that stronger low. This is kind of hovering in the area. That southeast wind 25 to 35 with 15 to 18-foot seas here. Another area of low pressure is driving the weather pattern here across the central and eastern chain, also a low. Across the west coast, north and east winds will be picking up 25 to 30 knots. Again, this will be moving some of the ice to the west as we go. 30 knots around St. Matthew with 18-foot seas, 20 knots around St. Paul and St. George from the south and east with a 10-foot sea. Northeasterly winds across the open water, 5-foot seas in Norton Sound. And again, that will continue as we head into Thursday. Become a little bit more of a northeasterly flow for just about all locations, 20 to 25 for the entire west coast. Expect about 5 to as high as 10-foot seas around St. Matthew. Most areas along the coast about 5 to 7. For the north slope, light winds from the north and east around 10 knots. High pressures in the area. That should keep things fairly calm. Easterlies across the Chukchi Sea, 20 to 25 though, and blustery through the Bering Strait with a 30-knot flow and 6-foot seas there. Not much of a change across the north slope for Thursday. The Chukchi coast looking at east and northeasterly flow at about 15 knots or so. Recapping tonight's weather, colder air is pushing southward. That will bring a cloudier change to many in south central and southeast, and certainly cooler weather in the north. Look for blustery conditions developing, especially after about 9 or 10 o'clock tonight as that colder air starts to move across some of the lower terrain. Gusts up to 40 miles per hour across the Steets and Elliott Highway passes and across some of the higher terrain for areas around Tanana and north and west out toward Bettles. Low pressure will sit in the Gulf. You'll keep clouds across southeast, but not much of a chance for precipitation until Thursday, and watch for a little bit of snow across some of the southeastern highways.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.